Hello! This lesson discusses the genre, a concept that has specific ramifications in terms of rhetorical analysis and in the rhetorical tradition. Today's keywords are going to be agora, apologia, constellation, form, and genre. So, 2 seconds in, and we're already mentioning Aristotle, because we kind of have to, don't we? But remember, his forensic, judicial, and epideictic rhetoric each had a time, a place, and a focus. Bitzer would argue the focus had to account for exigencies and the concerns of the audience. So with that said, who was the audience for Aristotle's species of rhetoric? You had the courts, who heard forensic rhetorical cases, the agora, an open area meeting ground for people in the Greek polis, and the deliberative rhetoric you'd come across in the assembly. But who is the audience for these? And how does an audience influence what you include in a rhetorical address and how you include it? When composing a speech, essay, resume, thank you card, etc., what is important for you to know about your audience? Bitzer claimed that recurrent situations tended to give rise to similar rhetorical responses. These similar responses are often grouped together as a genre. Here's an odd thing about genres. They create expectations for an audience. They are, among other things, constraints in a rhetorical situation. Okay, so here, let me break character as the prof and go ahead and talk about media. You go to a movie, and it's billed as a comedy. Well, it turns out it's this really psychodramatic, heavy, intense thing, and you start crying. Does that mean it wasn't a comedy? Well, yes and no. But it could mix elements of comedy with drama and tragedy, etc., etc. See, this is what we talk about when we say that genre creates expectations. But Campbell and Jamieson do some work on form and genre that talk about genre as a set of interrelated qualities that flex and change. Focusing on Campbell and Jamieson, and their writing on form and genre. The introduction of their piece argues the value of formal and generic analysis must be tested in application and practice, and that tracing dynamics and changing relationships between rhetorical elements enriches criticism. For them, a genre was, quote, a group of acts unified by a constellation of forms that recurs in each of its members. And that's on page 20. They believe rhetorical forms, which establish genres, are stylistic and substantive responses to perceived situational demands, as page 19 notes. These forms create certain expectations in their audiences and induce participation of certain kinds. Question 1. Identify 3 examples of a genre as it relates to rhetoric. Feel free to use episodes from your own daily life, as well as movies, film, radio, or television, and of course social media. So let's look at forms. A form is a structural element of the discourse in question. For example, think about a logical structure like an enthymeme, or a linguistic figure like alliteration, parallelism, or repetition, or repetition, or repetition. Okay, you can allow me 1 joke per lecture. The form relates to the style, which is made up of characteristics of the discourse appropriate to situational demands. Think about this in terms of what's appropriate for where and when. Is the tone somber? Enthusiastic? How about the diction? The word choice? Is it sophisticated? Simple? Then think about linguistic tropes like metaphors, similes, or synecdoche, which are representations of parts for the whole, or the whole for the part. This is what they talk about in the introduction when they discuss Barbara Jordan's speech, the form of enactment, where Jordan physically represented the argument she was making. Her making that speech was the proof of the speech's validity. Quote, and if one recognized the form, one understood the force of her speech. One knew why her words were greeted with sustained applause. In the reading, the fact that this speech was memorable was because it was a speech given by Barbara Jordan. If you reread the introduction, be sure and pay attention to enactment, because that's important to their argument. Question 2. What expectations might we have as an audience member for a eulogy? Can you think of an example where you would have different expectations for one? Explain why. And here the question is, how does form relate to genre? But let's go back to look at what exactly a genre is in the first place. Campbell and Jamieson claim on page 16 that if the recurrence of similar forms establishes a genre, then genres are groups of discourses which share substantive, stylistic, and situational characteristics. In the same paragraph, they also state, a genre is a group of acts unified by a constellation of forms that recurs in each of its members. The forms may appear in other discourses and expectation, but what is distinctive about genre is the recurrence of the forms together in constellation. And so this brings us to the discussion on eulogies. And in a eulogy, there are situational requirements, strategic responses, and stylistic choices that come together to constitute that eulogy. Campbell and Jamieson say these exist in a reciprocal, dynamic relationship. Expectations are created by way of internal and external forms. And so when it comes to genres, quote, generic exemplars have an internal consistency. You also have the substance of a rhetorical endeavor to consider. This would be applicable or concerned with common themes in the discourse: hope, memory, redemption, or regret, for instance. Pay attention to the term constellation, whereby, quote, a genre is composed of a constellation of recognizable forms bound together by an internal dynamic. Here we go back to forms, because on page 17, Campbell and Jamieson write, a genre is given its character by a fusion of forms, not by its internal elements. Campbell and Jamieson also claim some genres are established deductively from a model, although not without possible issues, citing apologia as an example. Apologia would be a formal defense of an action, a position, or a thought or opinion. While others are established by way of induction, which is where they bring up different approaches to the eulogy, and you'll remember we discussed induction and deduction earlier. Although they claim in most cases the inductive efforts would disappoint, and that a genre-based claim wouldn't be warranted by the evidence. Confusion between these can also create issues, as is noted on page 19. The authors clarify that genre-based critics need to explicitly recognize the assumptions they are making and procedures required to establish their claims. Alright, the last few pages of this text get rather complex in terms of what genres are and how they function, but Campbell and Jamieson really show the value of the genre-based approach when they go back to the concept of the constellation. They discuss how the elements move and remain in relationship with one another, despite positions changing over time, like a constellation would in the sky. They argue constellations function like genres, as opposed to genres functioning like constellations, which is a neat trick, and that they let us see the movement of individual stars so as to understand their dynamics and their interrelated movements in space. A genre is a classification based on the fusion and interrelation of elements in such a way that a unique kind of rhetorical act is created. Approaching such acts generically gives the critic an unusual opportunity to penetrate their internal workings and to appreciate the interacting forces that create them. In short, genres give you some flexibility, but not a chaotic basis upon which to analyze text. It's less rigid. You can mix syntax and syntactics, bits and pieces, etc., but still look at rhetorical texts, or speeches, or discourse in terms of forms, situations, and dynamics. Let's think about this in terms of a speech. For example, a eulogy. With regard to the situation, in many cases, the situation is that a community is ruptured by death. People have to alter their relationship with the deceased and confront their own mortality when they listen to a eulogy. Now think about the substance of this. A eulogy acknowledges that death. It juxtaposes past and present to recast the relationship with the deceased to one of memory. It also assures the audience that the deceased lives on via memory. It may also appeal to an audience with the goal that they could carry on works, embody virtues, or live as the deceased would have wished them to. In that sense, a eulogy might even be funny, humorous, or juvenile. Then think of the form as it relates to style. You could imagine metaphors of rebirth or of new beginnings, or perhaps even metaphors of survival after death in deeds, family, or history, the denial of death through continued lineage and action. The eulogy is also performative. By uniting the bereaved in a rhetorical act, the eulogy affirms that the community will survive the death. Things will continue on. The eulogy thus reknits the community and heals it. And what if there are elements of other genres in a eulogy? Say, some mordant humor, some dry wit, some vulgarity, some curse words, some this and that. We would call that a generic hybrid. How would you evaluate it? Well, you could do so in part by paying careful attention to the nature of the rhetorical situation, but also to the way the parts mix together to reflect the nature of the speech. Epidictic speech can, indeed, be a mixture of various thoughts, approaches, and sentiments and ideas, even if they culminate in the praise of the subject. Question 3. Why would a genre-based approach be beneficial for students of rhetoric according to Campbell and Jamieson? Do you believe that to be the case? Why or why not? So this all speaks to what is known as the generic perspective, which, quote, recognizes that while there may be a few clearly distinguishable genres, all rhetoric is influenced by prior rhetoric. All rhetorical acts resemble other rhetorical acts. This approach would allow critics to cut across time, not just study isolated slices of it, linking to patterns and habits through time, rhetorically. Alright, so that's the first week. Hope everything's going well for you. Again, please check in with me if you have not checked in with me. That's a vital part of your grade. Participation is really important. And also, I should note that our first assignment is going to be due on Tuesday. Please don't sleep on that. It's really important that you spend the time doing the work. And again, if I can clarify anything for you, my job is to act as a resource for you, and I want to see you do well, and I'm happy to engage with you in any way, shape, or form. Take care, have a great weekend, be safe. See you later.